In this video, I'm going to be talking about the nervous system. So the nervous system is basically a communication system. Okay, it can be thought of as being synonymous with the word communication system. And it's responsible for overseeing and helping the other systems function. So examples include the digestive system. In other words, the processing of food, the respiratory system, responsible for gas exchange in our bodies, so the inhalation of oxygen and the exhalation of carbon dioxide, and so on and so forth. And the nervous system relies on things called neurons, okay, or nerve cells. So we're made of nerve cells just as we're made of hair cells, blood cells, bone cells, skin cells, etc., etc. So the term nerve cell is actually synonymous with the word neuron, as it's known as in neuroscience. And there are two types of nervous system. You've got the central nervous system, also known as CNS for short, central nervous system. And you've got the peripheral nervous system, PNS for short. Now, the central nervous system consists of your spine, your brain and your spine. Okay, central because just picture your body. Let's say that's a body here. Okay, the brain is, if you were to draw a line sort of cutting our bodies in half, you'd find that the brain is sort of in the center along with the spine, right? Hence, central nervous system. Peripheral nervous system consists of the nerves that make up our body. Okay, and nerves, they branch off our spine. Okay, so here's our spine, here's the spine here. They branch off it. Now, neurons come in two basic sorts. So a neuron can take the form of what's known as a motor neuron or a sensory neuron. And as the names suggest, a motor neuron is responsible for movement, and a sensory neuron is responsible for sensing, okay, experiencing a sensation. Okay, for example, a hot liquid, let's say, when you're holding something that's really hot, you'll react to that because of sensory neurons being activated. And motor neurons, okay, they're responsible for activating effectors, okay, things like glands, muscles, and so on and so forth. Okay, just think of motor as in something that's moving. So, and I should mention that motor neurons, they carry messages from the central nervous system to effectors. Okay, things like muscles, for example. Whereas sensory neurons carry messages from cells making up your sense organs, okay, for example, the skin, to your central nervous system, so to your spine and brain. Okay, so neurons, they're basically, you can think of neurons as like electrical cables. They carry information, they carry what are known as nerve impulses, okay, from place to place. So what's a motor neuron and sensory neuron look like? So a motor neuron looks something like this. So you've got like a blob. This is called that's called the cell body. Okay, it's the main part of the neuron, of the nerve cell. Then you have what you can think of as the electrical cable. Okay, this is called the axon. Okay, think of that as the cable. Okay, cell body, that's the main part. Okay, just like all other types of cells have got a main sort of component. And wrapped around the axon is what's called a myelin sheath. This is basically like an insulator, right? It's like a layer of fat protecting the cable, the axon. Coming out of the axon is what's called the axon terminals. Okay, the very end bit of the neuron. Okay, think of an airport terminal, right? That's where you leave, right? The airport, that's where you take off on a plane. Similarly, in this case, the nerve impulse travels along the axon and it leaves via the axon terminals. And you've also got what are called dendrites, which are like branch-like structures coming out of the cell body. Okay, these are the receptors. These detect information from another neuron, a neighboring neuron. Dendrites. Okay, these are like the receptors, the detectors. Okay, so that's the anatomy of a motor neuron. Okay, they're found all over our bodies and they carry out functions as specified by the central nervous system, okay, aka the brain and spine, and they carry out information and they execute that information via the use of effectors, so muscles, for example. So that's a motor neuron. A sensory neuron looks a bit different. Okay, you've got one long dendron, you've got an axon, you've got the cell body coming off a dendron like this. You've got the axon terminals. I should mention actually, apologies. A dendron is something which dendrites branch off. Okay, so here, this region here, it's called a dendron. Okay, so you've got a branch, a dendron, and the sub-branches are the dendrites. So you've got one dendron along a sensory neuron. You've got the cell body hanging out from the side. And you've got receptors sticking out of the dendron, I should say. Okay, so receptors to detect things, to detect sensations. And I should mention here, dendrites, they're not really receptors. They're basically just things which allow for information to transfer from another neuron to this neuron here. And I should also mention one last thing. I'm just going to draw a simplified diagram. So neurons, so the space between two neurons, so let's say that's the end of a neuron, and that's the start of a neighboring neuron. Okay, that's called a synapse. And in this region, so let's pretend that we've got axons here. So that's an axon here, for example. Electrical impulses get converted into what's called a neurotransmitter, into a chemical called a neurotransmitter in the space between two neurons in the synapse. Okay, it's a chemical. And that chemical then gets converted into a electrical impulse once it hits another neuron, and so on and so forth. This sort of occurs along many neurons.